What is going on, everyone? My name is Andy. Welcome back to another FPL video. In this one, it's some of my final thoughts ahead of the Game Week 19 deadline, which is of course not too far away. So I'm going to really quickly go through how my team is currently looking. I know I did a team selection video last night, but I've had a few updated thoughts about who to bring in for Reece James. And then we'll do a purely Q&A and try and get through the answers as quickly as possible. Anything I don't cover, I will try and talk about in the deadline stream later today, which we'll be doing as well. Obviously, Game Week 18 didn't finish that long ago, so this is kind of initial reactions. My mind might change by the time we get to the deadline later today, but let's see what happens. I'll try and get through as many questions as possible. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a like, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and let's jump into it. So just a couple of things on my team. I have switched the captaincy armband from Mason Mount to Mitrovic. I don't know whether that will stick. The only thing that's in my mind is the yellow card situation. If he was on 3 yellow cards and there was no issues with suspensions in Game Week 19, then I would definitely captain him, because I think there's enough upside there with fixtures against Leicester away and Chelsea at home. On paper, they don't look great, but neither side has defended that well for most of this season. And obviously, Mitrovic has been consistent. He's pretty nailed for starts, minutes, penalties, and all that kind of good stuff as well. So I do really like him. I think if I decide that the yellow card situation is too much of a risk, then I will just default back to Mason Mount. I'm not really considering going for Haaland. I know that could be a mistake. I know his ownership is still going to be massive. I know a lot of people are going to captain him because he's a safe pick, etc. And obviously, if I'm saying that Chelsea is a good game for Mitrovic, it's also a good game for Haaland. But I prefer to chase that upside from a double game week player. And I know a lot of people will say double game weeks are overrated, but that's because people always forget the bad ones. And they always remember the bad ones. They always forget the good ones as well. So right now it's on Mitrovic, because I don't think the odds of getting a yellow specifically in that Leicester game are necessarily that high. And if he doesn't get one, I think there's enough upside there to go for him as captain. And also, just not necessarily been that impressed with Mason Mount. Obviously, it's a bit different for me because I had him in Game Week 17 and he's already got me 10 points in one game, 2 in the other. So 6 points per game is not that bad. Whether or not I would bring him in now is a different question, which we'll get onto later on. But I just think once Reece James went off the pitch against Bournemouth, it just hasn't looked quite as good for Chelsea. That's obviously a very small sample size. They might do okay against Man City and Fulham. Like, Fulham defence isn't very good either. But it's just enough there to kind of put me off a little bit. I still like Mount because I think his minutes are pretty much guaranteed. He should get 2 starts. But from a goal scoring perspective, Mitrovic is much more likely to score. So that's why I've switched. Maybe I'll change it back by the deadline. We'll have to wait and see. The other thing is I'm playing Cancelo as it stands. I think no matter what happens, whatever transfer I make this week, unless Pep comes out and says Cancelo is done or injured, which we're not even going to get, another press conference anyway before the deadline, I'm pretty confident he's got a chance of getting minutes against Chelsea from the start. And if he does, then he's got a double game week. So I definitely don't want to sell him. But I'm also thinking, is there anyone I really want for Reece James? I love double game weeks, but if I buy Cucurella or any Chelsea defender or Luke Shaw this week, that's fine, but I don't know how useful they are to me going forward. For example, if I roll the transfer this week and then I decide to sell Reece James in Game Week 20, I'm pretty sure that unless Man United have a double game week, I won't buy Shaw or a Chelsea defender. So that makes me wonder what kind of long-term options they are. Like, if I buy Luke Shaw, I think I'd probably play him twice in the next 5 game weeks. Obviously, if he gets a double, that's different, but that is not guaranteed. So I'm currently thinking, do I just save the transfer, go with this team, hope that Cancelo starts? I think most of the other players, like Kepa, Trippier, White, Mount, is going to get at least 1 game. Mitrovic is going to get at least 1 game. Haaland should start. All my midfield should start as well. I shouldn't, famous last words, need the bench too much. So even if Cancelo doesn't play and doesn't come on, I've got Patterson there. So I think it might be worth just taking the risk and going into next week with 2 transfers instead. I know Luke Shaw is a better option than Cancelo this week. I get that. It's just whether or not using the transfer is better than saving it for next week. And bearing in mind, if we are going to get double game week announcements for those teams like Arsenal and Brighton, Man United, Liverpool, etc., I would hope that we would get them by game week 20. So having 2 free transfers could leave me quite flexible. And given that I've already got a Chelsea attacker, I've already got Mitrovic, going for a Chelsea defender is probably not as much as a must. Now, I'm not saying I won't do it, and I won't. There is a chance that I will just bench Cancelo, but that's how I'm feeling right now. Captain on Mitrovic, play Cancelo, and then just hope for the best. Especially with no Andreas Pereira, he is definitely getting a double-digit haul this week. So if you could, would you bring in Trent for Reece James? Liverpool could be one of the teams that double in game week 21. And while that is true, it comes back to what I was just talking about with my own team. What if they don't double? Would you still then look to bring in Trent Alexander-Arnold? Because I'm in a similar situation with Luke Shaw, whereas if they were definitely doubling over the next couple of game weeks, I would definitely bring him in this week. But that is not the case. I think part of the thing with Trent is that people can afford him. That's why they're looking at him again. I don't think there's a huge amount of exciting defenders right now. If you've got an Arsenal defender and Trippier, there's not a huge amount of defenders outside that I would want. Obviously, if Cancelo plays both games in game week 20 and keeps his place, he could be a good option going forward, but he is also very expensive. Now, if you definitely want a Liverpool defender, Trent is the one that I would buy. Robertson, I think, came off with a slight knock in the last game. He might be fine, but I think in general he's more likely to miss minutes over kind of fixture congestion because of Tsimikas than maybe Trent Alexander-Arnold is. I think attacking-wise, Trent is probably still slightly better, although Robertson has obviously looked good when we've watched him in the last few games as well. So I don't think there's, much of a difference between the two. I would probably just go for Trent myself. I just think, having watched the last two games, Liverpool still look a little bit shaky at the back, so you are kind of relying a little bit on the attacking potential for Trent, and he has looked good again over the last couple. I'm just not sure he's necessarily worth the money. So what I would do is go to a transfer planner like FPL.team, put Trent in your team, and then see if there's any moves that you're then not able to make in the next few game weeks, because that's what I'd be worried about. Because one player I do want from Liverpool, for example, is Darwin Núñez, and if you go for someone like Trent, it makes it a lot harder to do. So I wouldn't write him off, and I think at a time when there's not many defenders that I can just kind of roll off the tongue that I think are excellent options, he's never a bad one, because we know the damage he can do from a kind of points perspective. But I just don't know if I would definitely bring him in for Reece James. If you've got an okay defence for this week, you can maybe leave it another week and then decide once we hopefully get those double game week announcements whether they're going to come or not. So is it worth captaining Mitrovic over someone like Haaland, who's arguably the best goal scorer in the league right now? I would say there's no argument, by the way. He just is, at this point in time, the best goal scorer. Mitrovic has been reliable this season, but it does feel like the double game week is forcing us to make a not so intelligent decision again. And that's the part of the question I want to focus on. I've already talked about what my captaincy thoughts are. I do think the upside for Mitrovic over a Haaland is definitely there for this week. If you want to go for Haaland, I'm not going to massively argue against it. But I do think that with those two fixtures, Mitrovic is probably the better captain, as long as he doesn't get the yellow card. If he does, there's going to be lots of I told you so's. Fair enough. Haaland's a great option this week, but I think Mitrovic is better. But it's the second point that I want to talk about, because I often see comments like this. Usually they're framed like, in YouTube comments or replies to tweets, something like, if it wasn't for the double game week, you wouldn't be considering this, either captaining a certain player or bringing a certain player in. And I just think, that's great, but there is a double game week, and therefore I'm going to include that when I make my decision, right? It's extra information. Now, this is not me saying that because there's a double, you have to go out and get 3 Fulham players and 3 Chelsea players, and you must captain one of them. That's not what I'm trying to say, but we shouldn't act as if the double game week doesn't become a part of that decision-making process, right? They do have an extra fixture. Does that make them better than someone else? A lot of the times, it will. Like Mason Mount, for example, I'm not going to, again, sit here and tell you absolutely have to bring him in, but when I did my Game Week 17 wildcard, I absolutely took into consideration that Mason Mount had an extra fixture over a lot of players, and I might get rid of him in Game Week 20 or Game Week 21, but having Bournemouth, then Forest, then a double, that definitely played a part. Would I have considered Mason Mount if he didn't have a double? Possibly not. But he does have a double, so why does it matter? It's a bit like saying, right, if I say to you, I'm going to captain this player, let's not say Haaland, that's too obvious, but let's say Haaland's injured, I'm going to captain this player because they've got Nottingham Forest at home, and everyone else has got really bad fixtures. That's like you turning around and saying, why would you consider that? If that player had Man City away, you wouldn't do that. Of course, that's different information, but they don't have Man City away, they have Forest at home. Similarly, they do have a double game week, they don't just have one game week. So again, we're going to talk about Chelsea midfielders and stuff like that and defenders in a second, but I think this idea that people always remember when things go wrong in double game weeks and forget when they go well, it happens every single time. Remember Fernandes last season, I think it was, had a double game week. I think it was Brighton Southampton. After the first game, everyone's saying, I told you so, double game weeks are bad. What happened in the second game? He scored, he got like 12 or 13 points. Happy days. So did Ronaldo, I believe. I can't remember exactly, but it always happens, right? So try and remember the good stuff as well as the bad stuff, and stop saying things like, and I'm not saying this person is doing that, but I see it a lot, and it kind of reminded me that you wouldn't do this if it wasn't for a double. Correct. There's lots of things I wouldn't do if the information was different, but it's not. So is it worth taking a hit for multiple double game week plays? In my case, I've already done Wilson to Mitrovic, and I could do Martial to Havertz as well. Only thing stopping me is Havertz could miss one game. And this ties in really nicely with what I've just spoken about, because I don't think it's necessarily worth taking multiple hits to get double game week players, especially if you're not going to be happy with them kind of longer term. Now, this week specifically, if Havertz was to start both games, I do think he's a better option than Martial, but you'd have also got to look that you'd lose 4 points doing that. Martial is a good fixture against Bournemouth, and as I've already mentioned a few times, there is an outside chance they could get a double in game week 20, in which case Martial would have the same number of fixtures. I don't know whether he's more nailed on than Havertz right now, because I think Graham Potter has kind of been talking him up. I'm not sure how much he trusts Aubameyang, but I don't think at the same time we can say Havertz is 100% nailed either. So I personally, for that particular move, don't think it's worth a hit. The other things that I would take into consideration is, if you've got Mitrovic and you're happy to captain him, then obviously you don't need Havertz for captain either. So then it is just a straight up Martial versus Bournemouth plus 4 points versus Havertz. And I wouldn't be massively convinced that Havertz was the better option. Now, if you wanted to keep Havertz longer term, because you were kind of sure that his minutes will be good, Chelsea do have some pretty nice fixtures after the double, and you could look to make that move, because Chelsea have a guaranteed double, Man United don't, at least not now. They will have some in the future. We just don't know for sure exactly when they'll be. But if you're not confident in all those things, Havertz keeping his minutes and starts, and Chelsea, doing better in attack than maybe they have done over the last couple of games, then I just wouldn't do it. I'd hold Martial, maybe use the hit for something else in the future, and just go from there. So lots of people ask this question, should I transfer Martial to Mitrovic? And the short answer is yes. In most cases, I would probably do this move. I can't really think of too many reasons why you wouldn't. I guess if you've got a different forward that's better to move on instead, then you could look at that. I know a lot of people have got Haaland, Darwin Núñez and Martial, and some people are considering moving on Darwin to kind of free up some money as well. And obviously Martial does have Bournemouth at home this week, and maybe with Gakpo there and Firmino when he's back from injury, Núñez's minutes might go down a little bit, but ultimately I think he is a better option than Martial going forward if you don't need the extra money that it would free up. But in terms of just Martial to Mitrovic in isolation, I think Mitrovic is definitely a better option this week. Yes, Fulham's fixtures on paper don't look that great, but they are an attacking side. When they do score, Mitrovic is usually involved. And also, if Man United don't get that double in game week 20, they've got Man City and then Arsenal, which isn't necessarily great. Martial can be quite injury prone. It's not necessarily a reason specifically to get rid of him, but it is something to factor in. And I don't think there's that much chance of him not starting against Bournemouth, but I wouldn't be surprised if his minutes were a little bit kind of managed, maybe coming off around the 65th minute, just because he's played in the 2 games that Man United have had so far. And if he plays in this one, that's 3 in a fairly quick turnaround for a guy that hasn't played a huge amount this season. So, like I said, I can't really see too many reasons not to make this move. I think it's a pretty good one, especially if you're happy captaining Mitrovic. So nice and simple, who is the best Chelsea defender for the double? So I'm going to answer the specific question, and then we'll come on to whether you should be looking to bring in a Chelsea defender or not. So the best option is probably one of these two. I do think, for what it's worth, with Reece James out, Azpilicueta will probably get pretty good minutes in that right back spot. My worry is just his age and whether or not he can play that many games. And let's not forget, although there is a week between Chelsea's first game of the double and the second, they do have that Man City fixture in the FA Cup in between, and we don't know how much they're going to rotate. So I think as a possible option where you bring in, they play longer term minutes, Thiago Silva or Cucurella is probably slightly better. Thiago Silva is definitely a player that people think gets rested way more than he does, but he's still not guaranteed to play every single game. I think he's missed 2 games so far this season. I think he's got to start against Man City. Whether or not he then plays the Fulham game as well, we'll have to wait and see. So I would go for one of these two. I don't think that Cucurella is necessarily that attacking, but while Chilwell is out, his minutes are pretty good. Chilwell is back in training training, when he is fully fit to play again, that might be a bit of an issue for Cucurella. And if they play a back five, Lewis Hall could play wing back as well, and Cucurella wouldn't be guaranteed to play left centre back. But I think ultimately for the double, Cucurella is a pretty good option for minutes. And although I've thought about Thiago Silva, if I was going to bring one in this week, it would probably be him. My main worry is, what are they like as options going forward, especially if you own Kepa as well. I do like the idea of getting to play them in game week 20, because if you bring someone like Shaw in and he doesn't have a double, it's Man City in that game week. And also, if you're someone that's thinking about playing Ben White, so a lot of people have got a similar setup to this, I think. Ben White, Cancelo and Trippier. Now, Trippier has got Fulham at home in game week 20, so you're happy playing him. Cancelo's got a double, so as long as he gets some minutes against Chelsea, I think most of us will play him for game week 20 anyway. But Ben White has Spurs away, so I think I'd rather play a Chelsea defender against Palace at home instead. But apart from that kind of reasoning, going forward, I don't know if there's a massive kind of obligation to have a Chelsea defender. I think the fixtures are pretty good outside of kind of Spurs and Liverpool games. I just don't know how much I trust them defensively, especially without Reece James. I think he is a massive miss going forward and kind of trying to keep the goals out as well. But also their minutes. What happens when Chilwell's back? Will Thiago Silva miss the odd game? Will Koulibaly keep his place, or will Chalobah come back in? Once Reece James is fit, Azpilicueta is going to be nowhere to be seen. What if they start a back five and Azpilicueta doesn't even play as wingback? There's all these questions, and I think in the very short term, Thiago Silva, Cucurella and Azpilicueta are probably all perfectly fine for game weeks 19 and maybe 20. It's just beyond that, really. So if I was going to bring one in this week, I think I'm on Cucurella, but I've flip-flopped a lot on this. At one point, I wanted Azpilicueta. At one point, I was looking at Thiago Silva. But if I do Reece James out, and it is for a Chelsea defender later, I think it'll be Cucurella, but I'm just not really sure about any of them. And that is kind of what's feeding into my thoughts about just not using a transfer this week. So let me know if you're bringing in a Chelsea defender this week, and who are you getting in the comments below. So who is the best Chelsea midfielder? Maybe Mason Mount, or a punt on Sterling or Pulisic. I think with Pulisic, I'm never going to be fully confident that he will play every single game, and that would be a little bit of a worry for me over the kind of next 3 fixtures that Chelsea have, including that FA Cup game. Like, they could quite easily put Sterling on the left and maybe play Ziyech or someone on the right instead. So I probably wouldn't go for Pulisic, although I do think he is the absolute definition of a punt for this double game week. I just wouldn't be that sure about his minutes. When it comes to Mount versus Sterling, if you told me that Sterling was going to start the next 2 games in the league for sure, then I think he is a better option than Mason Mount. If you go and look at his underlying numbers, expected goals, expected assists combined, they are better. He does have more of a goal threat. He's more likely to be in and around the box as well. So he is the better option. The only thing in Mason Mount's favour is the fact that, one, he's a little bit cheaper, so he's easier to get to for a lot of people. That's part of the reason why he's in my team, and I didn't really ever consider Sterling. But also his minutes are, and I don't want to say guaranteed because I know that will come back to bite me, but under Graham Potter, he is the player that's played the most minutes, and I just don't see him missing out no matter what kind of formation Chelsea go for. So that's kind of what's in his locker, is kind of decent minutes. But I don't think Sterling is going to miss a huge amount of games. I think he will play against Man City because I think he is part of Chelsea's best 11. It's just whether or not there's any rotation for that Fulham game. So I think if you were looking to captain someone, I think Sterling probably is a slightly better option than Mason Mount, just because I don't necessarily like using the word explosiveness, but if you think someone's going to get a big score between these two and they both play similar minutes, it probably would be Sterling. But if you want that safety, or if you have to rip your team apart to get Sterling in, I would just go for Mason Mount. Again, it's a bit like the defenders. Is it worth bringing them in? All I can tell you is I own Mason Mount, and if you look at my team, I've got Mount, Saka, Martinelli, Rashford, Salah. The only reason why I would consider getting rid of Rashford before Mason Mount is because they got City and Arsenal in 20 and 21. But even that I don't think will be enough, because he's cheaper, he's got more of a goal threat, and if I do get rid of a... And by the way, I just realised I've not actually made the captaincy switch there, so I'll do that now. If I do make a midfield move, or if I decide to put those funds into my forward line and go back to a 3-4-3, Mason Mount will almost certainly be the first one that goes, because his underlying numbers are just not great. The only reason I've really got him in is fixtures, the double, and his minutes, and I just think going forward, he's not necessarily going to be someone I want. So think carefully before you bring him in. I'm not trying to put you off, but yes, if you think Sterling starts twice, which I think there is a good chance, he's the better option. If you want to go for assured minutes, or hopefully assured minutes, you probably just go for Mount. So is Tete or any other Fulham defender a good idea? They are cheap and have a double, but their defence is not the best. It's that last point that I would really focus on. They are not a good defence whatsoever, and I don't think a double game week counteracts that in any way, and I wouldn't look to bring in a Fulham defender. I'm just not sure you're going to want them going forward. Again, there's not a huge amount of exciting defender picks, so if you can bench them for most of the time, then maybe you could go for it. I just don't think they keep a clean sheet in either of these two fixtures, and the funny thing is, I think there is a chance that they can get results against both Leicester and Chelsea, either draws or wins, but that's because they can score goals. They are capable of doing that. Mitrovic is always someone that can get you something, and when you look at their XG generated for the season, they're about mid-table, so they can go and get goals, but from an expected goals conceded perspective per 90 minutes, they are the second worst team in the league so far this season, and Leicester and Chelsea both have kind of players that are going to be capable of scoring against Fulham. So I don't think the attacking potential of any Fulham defenders or the double game week kind of counteracts it. They are just not a good defence, and I just don't think they're going to be players that you want moving forward. So should we bench Trippier against Arsenal? I know for a lot of people it's blasphemy to even be considering this, but it is one of the hardest games they're going to play all season. Arsenal are top of the league and not by fluke or anything like that. As we're going to see from the next question I talk about, the Arsenal attack is pretty good. So you would say the chances of a clean sheet are pretty low for Trippier. He does have some attacking threat and he is pretty good going forward, but most of that is from creating chances rather than, you know, huge goal threats. So he's more likely to get you an assist than a goal, which obviously aren't worth as many points. And also, the Arsenal attack is not just good, the defence is also good as well, so you would imagine they would limit Trippier somewhat. What I'm trying to say is, the chance of a big haul, like double digits against Arsenal, is quite low. But on the flip side, I don't think you should be going out of your way to bench him. I don't think he's so bad that you need to make sure you've got someone else on the pitch instead, and I don't think most people's squads are in a position where they need to be benching him either. I think if you look at mine, for example, I'm not going to play, even though Patterson on paper's got the better fixture, I'm not going to play him against or ahead of Trippier, because although Arsenal are great, Newcastle have also been really good, so they are going to limit Arsenal somewhat as well, and we do know that Trippier does have some attacking threat. He'll take set pieces too, so I definitely play him again ahead of Patterson. And if I sell Reece James, it's to bench Cancelo instead, because his minutes aren't guaranteed obviously, and Chelsea could score against Man City. What I wouldn't do if Cancelo had a better fixture was go out of my way to sell James just to bench Trippier, because what he can do can hurt. His ownership is quite high as well. So I think for some people, if you happen to have, I'm trying to think of what bench or what defenders you would have to even consider. Maybe if you've got like a Chelsea defender like Cucurella or Azpilicueta already, then you would obviously want to play them. You could have Luke Shaw against Bournemouth. I think he is a better option than Trippier this week. And then if it comes down to an Arsenal defender versus a Newcastle defender, that gets very tricky, because the Arsenal defence is very good and they do have a better chance of a clean sheet than Newcastle do. So on paper, you could probably play Shaw, a Chelsea defender, and an Arsenal defender ahead of Trippier. Whether or not you'd want to do that, I don't know. Obviously, Ben White doesn't have as much attacking potential as Trippier, but that's at the point you could at least consider it. Anything outside of that, I would probably just play him. It's not worth the headache for me. So what do you think about the Arsenal midfield? Could we triple up with the form they're in? Now, in general for Arsenal, if you're not already tripled up, that looks like a pretty good move going forward. So think about how you might want to do that, even if it's not this week because of the double, maybe next week, the week after, etc. But 3 Arsenal players looks pretty good. They're just such good value. There's no real reason not to have that. Let's talk about this question specifically. What do you think about the Arsenal midfield? Now, I think you could triple up. I can't really think of too many reasons in isolation that any of these players are not good picks. They're just as good as most other midfielders in the game right now, and in a lot of cases they're better. So if I've already got Saka and Martinelli, which I do, adding Odegaard is not really an issue. I know people hate tripling up on attacks because if they only win 1-0, obviously not every player can return, but most players are not going to return every single week anyway, so I wouldn't worry about that. But just to play devil's advocate for a second, okay, and I come on to my team to kind of give this example, just forget that I've got Ben White for a second. Let's just pretend that I've only got Martinelli and Saka. If I wanted to add Odegaard instead of Mason Mount, I actually think that's okay, because I'm on a 3-5-2. I've still got Rashford, I've still got Salah. That looks pretty good. But for those of you that are on a 3-4-3, let's say you've got Andreas Pereira as one of your midfielders, I would question whether filling 3 of those spots with Arsenal players is a good idea, just because of the domino effect of kind of positions elsewhere. So if you've got 3 of of your 4 midfielders that are going to play most weeks, obviously Andreas Pereira, you could play this week because it's a double, but let's say it's a single game week, having 3 of the 4 as Arsenal players, that means you've only got one of Salah or De Bruyne or Rashford or even Almiron, who people keep telling me about, right, even though I don't own him. That's already 4 midfielders that are pretty good, and you can only have one of them. Now, you can turn around and say to me, that doesn't matter. The Arsenal players are extremely good value, and that is a really good counterpoint. But my counterpoint to that would be, Rashford's a pretty good option, right? And Odegaard's brilliant, but is he that much better than Rashford? I would say possibly not. Yes, Salah has not been at his best so far this season, but that could happen moving forward. I don't feel like having that much money wrapped up in Salah is that big of an issue. What that does allow me, by not having Odegaard, is to have an Arsenal defender at a time where Arsenal defence is really good, and there's not a huge amount of other options to go for. Whereas in midfield, I can think of lots of players that I would want to go for instead. And just forget about Mason Mount for a second, because at some point I can easily just switch him to Andreas Pereira and upgrade Greenwood instead and go back to this formation instead. And if it was 3-4-3, I just don't think I need to go out of my way to get Odegaard as well. Obviously, if you're already on a defender, it does make it a little bit trickier. Maybe there is some bias there, because getting rid of White just to bring in an Arsenal midfielder, that's obviously 2 transfers while there's lots of other stuff going on. And although they've not been great recently, and yes, they do have Spurs away, Man United at home, they're going to be tricky for clean sheets. In general, I think they're just such a good, solid defensive side that I think having one of their defenders is a pretty good move. But if you're looking at this fixture list thinking, okay, they're Newcastle, trouble, Spurs, not been great, but they could score. Man United might lose, but they could score as well. They've got Man City in game week 23. I'm looking at the next kind of 6 fixtures thinking there's a lot where there's no clean sheets there and you're happy to go elsewhere, then absolutely go and triple up. The only thing I would think about is just, could you fill those Arsenal slots better? Could it be good to have like a Salah or De Bruyne, Rashford, Odegaard, Saka midfield, 4, and then having Nketiah up front instead, for example, if there's not a huge amount of forwards that you would want to. So generally, I think they're great. I think that individually they're all brilliant options, and I think that will continue going forward. So therefore, they're good as a trio as well. It's just whether or not you can fill those Arsenal spots a little bit better elsewhere. There we go, very quick turnaround for Game Week 19, but hopefully you enjoyed the video and found it useful. If you did, make sure to give it a like and hit that subscribe button if you haven't done so already. I'll be back later on for the deadline stream. Remember that the deadline for Game Week 19 is a little bit earlier than normal. It's 4 PM UK time, so the deadline stream will start around 2, maybe 2:30, and I'll try and answer as many questions as possible, and I'll finally get my team locked in, whether or not I'm going to sell Reece James, whether or not I'm going to captain Mitrovic or Mason Mount, or maybe even I just default to Haaland, but I don't think that will happen. Either way, I'll leave it there so I can go and get this uploaded, give you as much chance to watch it as possible. Thank you for watching, give it a like, hit subscribe, I'll catch you again soon.